It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the world seemed to move a little slower. The cafe buzzed with life, but not in an overwhelming way. Just enough chatter and laughter to create a soothing background hum. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of pastries displayed behind the glass counter. By the large window, a young woman sat alone, cradling a warm cup of coffee in her hands. She had come here for a moment of peace, a break from the chaos of daily life. With her phone in one hand and a quiet smile playing on her lips, she scrolled absent-mindedly, lost in her own little world. She wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. And then, something changed. The slight rustling of movement in front of her made her look up. A man stood there, smiling as if they were old friends. For a second, she struggled to place him. He wasn't a complete stranger. There was something vaguely familiar about his face. Maybe an old acquaintance? Someone she'd met briefly at a gathering? She couldn't quite remember, but before she could figure it out, he spoke. "Hey, remember me?" His tone was warm, almost too friendly. She hesitated, forcing a polite nod. "Yeah, I think so. How have you been?" Without waiting for an invitation, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. It was so casual, so unbothered, as if this was normal, as if they had planned to meet. She blinked, slightly taken aback. Most people would at least ask before sitting down. But she brushed off the discomfort and tried to be polite. Maybe he was just being friendly. Maybe he didn't realize how unexpected this was. At first, the conversation felt harmless. He asked the usual things, how she'd been, what she was up to these days. She answered with short, polite responses, trying to keep things light. But then, his questions became more specific. "Where do you live now?" She hesitated. "Oh, not too far from here." "Really? Which street?" That was an odd follow-up. She forced a small smile. "Just nearby." He nodded but didn't seem satisfied. "Are you still working at the same place?" Her grip on her coffee tightened. Something about the way he was asking felt off. It wasn't the curiosity itself. It was the insistence, the way he leaned in slightly, as if her answers were something he was entitled to. She tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, asked him how he'd been, what he was up to. But somehow it kept circling back to her. "Do you live alone? Are you in a relationship? How often do you come here?" With every new question, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Why did he need to know all this? At first she answered out of politeness, each response shorter than the last. But the more he asked, the more she realized something. She didn't owe him these answers. She didn't have to share details about her life just to be nice. She glanced around the cafe, suddenly aware of the other people lost in their own conversations, their own lives. None of them seemed to notice the discomfort growing between her and the man sitting across from her. Something about this moment, about this seemingly harmless conversation, made her rethink everything she had ever believed about politeness, privacy, and the right to her own space. And soon, she would realize, this wasn't just a random encounter. It was a lesson she never expected to learn. Her heart beat a little faster, not in fear, but in awareness. A strange awareness that she was giving away too much. Small details, little fragments of her life, without even realizing it. Why? Because it felt awkward not to. Because saying, "I'd rather not answer," seemed rude. Because she had been taught to be polite, to be accommodating, to avoid making people uncomfortable, even at the cost of her own discomfort. But this time, something felt different. She studied the man in front of her. He wasn't threatening, not in an obvious way. He smiled easily, spoke in a way that sounded casual. But something about him, the way his questions pushed past normal curiosity, the way he kept leaning in just a little too much, set off an internal alarm. She didn't know him well, yet he was asking things a close friend might, and she was answering. A quiet realization crept in. This wasn't a conversation. This was an intrusion. The moment she saw it for what it was, everything shifted. Her fingers curled around her coffee cup, the warmth grounding her. She forced a small smile, trying to stay composed. "I don't really talk much about personal stuff," she said lightly. It was a test. A small boundary, a line drawn in the sand. His reaction told her everything. His expression faltered, just for a second. His friendly demeanor cracked, like a mask slipping out of place. Then, just as quickly, he recovered, laughing softly. "Oh, come on," he said. "It's just small talk." But was it? Small talk didn't make you feel exposed. Small talk didn't make your gut twist in warning. Her eyes flicked to the cafe door, considering leaving. But why should she? She had come here to enjoy her time. She wasn't the one making this uncomfortable. Instead, she met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I prefer to keep some things private." This time, there was no hiding the shift in his demeanor. His smile tightened. The easygoing attitude in his posture stiffened. "It's not a big deal," he muttered. "Just a conversation." But it was a big deal. Not because of him, because of what this moment meant. For so long, she had treated boundaries as optional, something to push aside for the sake of being nice. She had ignored discomfort, dismissed that inner voice that whispered when something felt wrong. Not anymore. This time, she listened. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her mind clearer than before. "I should get going," she said, standing up. No excuses, no explanations. Just a choice. Her choice. The man sat there watching her, his expression unreadable. Maybe he would let it go. Maybe he wouldn't. But it didn't matter. Because for the first time, she understood something important. Privacy isn't just about keeping secrets. It's about control. About deciding what parts of yourself you share and with whom. And most importantly, it's about knowing when to walk away. As she stepped out of the cafe, the cool breeze hit her skin, refreshing and grounding. But her mind was still racing. Not in fear. No, it wasn't fear. It was something else. A sudden, sharp clarity that she had never felt before. She walked down the street, replaying the encounter in her mind. The way his questions had slowly stripped away her comfort. The way she had almost given away too much, simply because it felt easier than saying no. How many times had she done this before? How many times had she smiled through discomfort, shared details she didn't want to, just to avoid awkwardness? Too many. And now, for the first time, she saw it for what it was. Not just an annoying conversation, not just a pushy acquaintance, but a pattern. A pattern she had been caught in for years without even realizing it. She glanced around as she walked. The world felt different, like she was seeing things more clearly than before. A young woman sat on a park bench nearby, her shoulders slightly hunched, nodding as the man beside her spoke animatedly. Even from a distance, it was obvious. She wasn't comfortable. She was trapped in that same polite loop, responding with forced smiles, giving away pieces of herself she probably didn't want to. At another cafe across the street, a group of coworkers laughed around a table, but one of them, a man in a suit, kept glancing at his phone, tense, distracted. His colleague was pressing him about something, and even though he clearly didn't want to answer, he was doing it anyway. She had never noticed these things before, or maybe she had, but she had been so used to it, so used to seeing people disregard their own comfort just to keep the peace, that it hadn't seemed strange. But now, it did. She thought back to social media. to the way people shared their lives online, offering up personal details for strangers to consume. How often had she posted things just because it felt normal? Because that's what everyone did? Was it really normal? Or had everyone simply accepted that privacy was something to be given away freely, without question? She reached a small park and sat down on a bench, staring ahead. The realization settled in deeper. She had spent years letting people into her space without a second thought. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers. She had answered questions she didn't want to answer. She had overshared. She had allowed conversations to cross lines she wasn't comfortable with. And why? Because she had never truly believed she had the right to say no. But she did. And now that she had seen it, truly seen it, she couldn't unsee it. This wasn't just about one man at a cafe. This was about something much bigger. About how people's boundaries were pushed every day. About how privacy had become something others felt entitled to. And about how it was up to each person to reclaim it. She sat on the park bench, watching the world move around her. The realization still lingered, heavy, yet freeing. For years, she had been caught in a silent struggle, giving too much, sharing too easily, letting others step over invisible lines. She hadn't even known she was allowed to draw, but now she knew better. And knowing better meant doing better. At first, the idea of saying no felt strange, unnatural almost. She had spent a lifetime being agreeable, polite, making sure no one felt uncomfortable, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort. Changing that wouldn't happen overnight, but she was ready to try. The first test came sooner than she expected. That evening, she was out with a group of friends. The conversation was light, full of laughter, until someone turned to her with a question she wasn't ready to answer. "So, are you seeing anyone these days?" It was a simple question, the kind people asked all the time. Before today, she would have answered automatically, feeling obligated to share something, even if she didn't want to. But now she recognized the choice she had. She smiled, not a forced smile, not an apologetic one, just calm and steady. "I'd rather not talk about that." A brief pause, a flicker of surprise in her friend's expression, and then nothing. The conversation moved on, just like that. She had expected resistance, maybe even a little judgment, but there was none. The world hadn't ended. No one had accused her of being rude. No one had demanded an explanation. That night, she thought about how often she had assumed people needed answers from her, when in reality, they didn't. It had never been about them. It had always been about her, about whether she felt obligated to answer. And now, she didn't. As the days passed, she kept testing her new understanding. A coworker pried about why she had left work early one day. Instead of making up an excuse or offering unnecessary details, she simply said, "I had something personal to take care of." A distant relative at a family gathering asked why she wasn't married yet. She chuckled softly and said, "That's my business." Each time the responses were different, sometimes met with acceptance, sometimes with a little pushback. But the more she stood her ground, the more she realized something important. People would always ask. That was out of her control. But answering, that was her choice. And the more she exercised that choice, the freer she felt. One afternoon, she was back at her favorite cafe, sipping coffee by the window. Across the room, she noticed a young woman in an all-too-familiar situation. A man sitting too close, asking too much, pushing too far. For a moment, their eyes met. And in that quiet second, she offered the girl a small, knowing smile. A silent message. You don't have to answer. You don't owe anyone your comfort. And just like that, she watched as the girl straightened her posture, took a breath, and gently but firmly set her own boundary. A simple moment, but one that proved just how powerful it was to finally say no. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the city as she walked home. The air was crisp, carrying the soft hum of life around her. Laughter from a nearby restaurant, the distant sound of a street musician playing a slow, thoughtful tune. But inside her, there was silence. A calm, steady kind of silence. For the first time in a long time, she felt in control. Not because she had shut people out, not because she had built walls around herself, but because she had finally learned the difference between connection and intrusion. And that difference? Choice. She thought back to all the times she had given away parts of herself without even thinking, the moments she had let people pry into her life, feeling like she had no option but to answer. She had believed, without realizing it, that her privacy wasn't truly hers, that politeness meant giving, and giving meant being good. But that wasn't true. Privacy wasn't about keeping secrets. It was about ownership, about choosing who got access to her thoughts, her feelings, her life. And boundaries? They weren't barriers. They were invitations, selective, intentional invitations to the people who had earned a place in her world. As she reached her apartment, she felt lighter, as if she had reclaimed something she hadn't even known she had lost. That night, she sat by her window, watching the lights flicker in the buildings across the street. Each window held a different life, a different story. Some people would share their stories openly. Others would keep theirs guarded, revealing only what felt right. Both choices were valid, because privacy wasn't about hiding, it was about deciding. She thought about the girl in the cafe, about how a single glance had been enough to remind her that she had a choice. Maybe, just maybe, she had done the same for her. And maybe, in a world where oversharing had become the norm, choosing what to keep to yourself was the most powerful thing of all. As she closed her eyes, a quiet peace settled over her. Not everyone would understand her newfound boundaries. Not everyone needed to. Because in the end, the only person who truly needed to respect them was her. So the next time someone asks for more than you're comfortable sharing, pause, breathe, and remember, your privacy is yours to protect.